Okay, I'm starting. Good evening, everybody. It is 6 p.m. I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Committee of the Whole for Tuesday, February 25th at 6 p.m. I would first like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the shared traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. Councillor Kobayashi, who is the chair of COTW, unfortunately has some personal matters and is not able to attend, hence the reason I'm sitting in the chair this evening. I am looking for a motion for approval for the agenda, please. Moved by Councillor Parkinson. Second. Do I need? Excuse me. So, do I need any seconders on COTWs? None. Okay. Thank you. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Moving on to public participation. This is an opportunity. We're also going to be allowing, is there any public? I think it's all staff. Okay, I was going to say the public does have an opportunity to speak after every item this evening. So we'll get down there. Moving on to presentations. 4.1, Grant Brown, Administrator of West Shore Park and Rec Society. Grant is our new, are you Executive Director? Is that your title, CAO? I don't know what, CAO. So congratulations, Grant, and welcome.
Thank you.
I'm just going to turn on your mic for you. Sorry. Actually, there's a button there too. You can also turn it on.
There we go. Okay, I'm just going to wait for that. Great. Thank you. Appreciate getting the opportunity to come and present to you with our requisition request and budget for 2020. I've got with me Jeff Wellham, who's the program manager, as well as Wade Davies, who's the operation manager, just in case any questions come up and whatnot that to help out with. Oops, sorry. So through the presentation, we're going to do a brief overview of what we projected to our results were for 2019, as well as a little picture on where we're sitting. As many of you know, we've sat with the same requisition since 2016. This will be the first increase that we're proposing so far. And then taking us through the 2020 and then finishing off with looking at a 5-year operating and capital budget to see where, so you guys can see where we're sitting. Okay. 2019 is looking quite strong. We've projected a surplus of 134,843. The big contributors to that is we're still seeing that increase in admissions and pass sales that there was that drop a few years ago with the West Shore Y opening, and we continue to be grabbing people back. That's also filtering into our lessons on both skating wasn't lost, but swimming lessons have grown quite a bit in the last couple of years. It seems as though the families are starting to drift back to our areas, and we're actually having to increase staffing and whatnot as well to be able to handle that. So we've seen passes sales are up 20% over 2018, which were a 25% increase from 2017 prior to that. We've seen a program registration just shy of 5% up over budget. As mentioned, swimming and skating lessons are a big part of that. We've also seen a large increase in some of our arts and culture programs. In particular, pottery has been very popular through 2019. Childcare revenue is up just shy of 16% versus budget. With the grants that we received with assistance from Colwood on applying for those, we are going to be beginning in the fall doing construction on the upper floor of the JDF to turn it into a childcare center, which we will then increase 80 spots there as well. We're definitely seeing, as the region is a large demand on childcare programs, and so we're trying to make sure that we're continuing doing that and providing that service for the Western communities. And golf revenue increased just over 2% in 2019, which is great because we've had a number of years of it dropping continually, and to see that bounce back a little bit is refreshing. And so far, at the end of the year, it's been good. The weather's been rough as of late, but hopefully we'll continue seeing that through 2020. As far as capital goes, to meet those reduced or not having increases for the last couple of years, a lot of capital projects have been pushed on as a way of trying to stay on budget. In 2019 and moving forward, you'll see in 2020, and when we see the 5-year, we're now having a lot of large capital projects are needing to be done as things need to be repaired. In 2020, the pool liner was replaced. We also did work on the library roofs, which the library covers, but also did one of the large roofs over top of the JDF arena. We did have the pool air handling unit was to be done at the same time as the longer shutdown in December. However, there were some delays in getting delivered, so it is now on site. It will happen this year, so that project has been pushed and will be completed in June or July 2020. That way we don't have to do any shutdowns, as they can just have the doors open, the weather's warmer, and so on. As mentioned, the historical financial situation, we haven't had an increase since 2016. Over that time period, the cost of living, Greater Victoria has increased 6.4%. We've been able to deal with that by increasing fee increases throughout the year. We reduced contingency expenses. We cut some auxiliary positions in both parks and maintenance to deal with those costs, reduced small equipment replacements. We also have increased program area expectations. We've been able to meet those, which has been great, but we are starting to push towards lines that we're not seeing any signs that won't be able to meet those, but they're getting risky as we're looking at a lot of programs being 90% full and so on. And if there's any sort of changes, that could become a risk moving forward, but we've been doing that. And as well as the curling facility was closed and replaced with indoor sports turf, which we had the grand opening just a couple weeks ago. For 2020, our requisition increase request is 2.5%, which works out to 0.63% per year over that time span since 2016. Some of the costs that we're dealing with to create that marker is a 2% collective bargain wage increase, 5% average utility increase over that time, as well as we've had a 10% increase in our insurance premiums. A big part of that is we had an appraisal done last year, hadn't been done for 10 years, and as expected, everything costs a lot more to replace now, and so our insurance as a result has gone up. To combat some of that, we've reconfigured our human resources department when our human resources manager retired, as well as we've done an average of 2% fee increase on rentals and programs across the board. And we've brought in and continue to bring in those performance performance results we saw in 2019 has become expectations for 2020. So increased expectation from our programs on what they're able to do. Those non-discretionary expenses to drive up that 2% wage increase. We have a $7.3 million, our biggest single cost is wages. And so that's $143,000. We had some step increases on wages, which was just over $28,000. The utility increases is $15,000, and then insurance premium cost is just shy of $20,000 increase from 2019 to 2020. To combat that, we've decreased that overall dollar amount by $92,000. Program fee increases and expectations increase of revenue of just shy of $150,000. Recreation integration contract was reduced by $15,000. Although you'll see when I get down to the expenses, it's offset. Basically, that agreement we did with recreation integration, which was a program we had to assist special needs users into our facilities, that program has ended. But we have included a position which we're hiring for right now to continue on doing that internally, which is what most of the departments within the region are doing to ensure that we still become an adequate, inclusive space. Administration contracts were reduced $44,500. As mentioned, the human resources department configuration saved us just over $30,000, and as well as going back to a regular pool shutdown instead of the lengthened 6-week shutdown because of the liner increase net revenues by just shy of $16,000. We included that inclusion worker, which is an increased expense from 2019 to 2020. We've partially reinstated our contingency budget that we've been cutting in previous years. Parks and maintenance repair costs we've increased by 3%, which worked out to just shy of $23,000. They hadn't had an increase in any of their operating expenses for the last 3 years, and as expected, costs are going up. As well as one of the big things we've been trying to do is deal with the concern that we've been addressing, as well as the owner councils, which is the long-term sustainability of our capital funding. And so we've started to increase and add on to new reserve fund contributions, and we're going to continue to do that every year as best as we can within budget requests. So we increased by just over $62,000 for 2020 by including a $10,000 road sign contingency, so that in 10 years when that comes up, there'll be no tax impact for the replacement of that. A $30,000 turf replacement for that indoor sports floor. So again, when it needs to be replaced, there's no tax impact. Part of this agreement with the increase of childcare spaces, we've also put in there to purchase another bus to be able to bring more kids, as we'll have 80 more spots. We've increased the reserve contribution for a bus replacement of $7,500 and IT infrastructure of $15,000. So we've got, unfortunately, there's some of our major IT, we've always done well with our workstations. Some of our major IT equipment is reaching end of life, and that's been a big part of a driver of costs and the replacement of that. And so that all these items, and we want to continue to do that, is when they need to be replaced, that we're not having a big tax ask at that time. We've got something set aside. This is the operating income, and it's a snapshot of the overall budget. On here, we've continued to maintain the $347,000 operating contribution to capital, in essence, the portion of the requisition from the owners that goes towards the capital projects. We've got the 2.5% increase in requisitions, and the operating revenue improvements based on the expectations of the programs, new programs that have gone in, as well as the fee increases, have gone up 5.9%. That contributes 74% of that overall increase of $477,000 on the expense side. So we're dealing with, in other words, $353,000 of the $477 is being dealt with by user pay. So we're dealing with that internally. The remaining portion is the requisition. For capital next year, we've got another really heavy $1.6 million capital projects coming forward. We've got some fitness equipment being replaced, which we do every year. That's covered by reserve. There's reserve contributions for that. Some major vehicles, large work being done within the center, as well as a couple large projects we've got. As you know, we received the grant to finally do the Juan de Fuca floor. 100,000 of that is going to be work done in 2020 on engineering around getting prepared to do that project in 2021. Those capital are being funded by reserves coming from the fitness equipment reserve. As mentioned, the Juan de Fuca arena reserve, which was funds that we received between 2009 and 2010 from the owners already. And then the remainder of that project is being dealt with by grant money. The equipment reserve, bus replacement reserve, which we contribute to every year, and as well as the net operating income, as mentioned, to make up the $1.6 million. That 2.5% then gets divided out through converted assessments on the owners. Langford and View Royal grew more than 13%, which the average for the 5 owners was 8.85. So their share of the requisition has grown this year, whereas Colwood's was 9.87%, so it was dropped 0.39%. Due to your size being the second largest, their dollar amount still increased, but it did increase by the full 2.5%. So what that means as far as the requisition goes, Colwood's increase for 2020 would be $7,204, which is a 0.67% increase over the amount that was for 2019. And as mentioned, that's reduced from the 2.5 as a result of the converted assessment growing at a slower pace as compared to the rest of the region. Okay. Requisition per capita, just some stats. Colwood's is holding strong as far as roughly the same number. 2019, the cost per resident of Colwood for the requisition was $58.71. In 2020, it's going to move up to $59.11. Some of the areas like Machosen has dropped just slightly, Highlands dropped slightly, and Langford and View, as for the reasons mentioned before, have grown at a higher amount. Regional comparisons. This is just a picture of how we do as compared to some of the statistics around a per capita cost, so cost per resident, as well as the user pay or cost recovery. We've listed on there, we've brought in the member budgets as well to try to get a bit of an apples to apples comparison for you compared to the likes of Saanich, Oak Bay, Victoria, and Esquimalt, who have a more comprehensive parks program than we do. And so sitting at there, when we bring it all together, our cost per capita, including yourselves, is $164 per resident, whereas the high end is Oak Bay at $222, and the low end, you've got Saanich at $133. The big drivers on some of those with Saanich is, of course, the greater population size. One to point out, we brought in this year and have the statistic for Panorama. The consultant that the board's been working with for the last 18 months use Panorama as an example against a lot of sort of ideas that we do, as they're most similar because they're, again, working with the CRD, but they don't have the full parks program. Looking at that, West Shore on ourselves, our cost per resident is $60, where Panorama's is $125. Our user pay ratio is 56-58, so our users cover our cost 56% of our costs, whereas there's 45. So just as a comparison, looking that we're sitting quite strong. Depending on which statistic you look at, we're sort of the top second performer from the top one, depending on which one you look at. So pretty pleased as far as that goes. And finally, the last slide is just a 5-year financial forecast. It's pretty small, so I'll try to point out some of the pieces on here. Capital projects stay really high. 2021 is very high, but that includes the replacement of the arena floor, which is covered. 1.3 is covered from grant funds, and the remaining 700,000 is covered by funds we already hold from the owners. On here, we've got we continue to have contributions from from operating to reserve. In 2020, we're looking at 226,000 total contributions. 2021, we look to increase that to 276, and that flatlines there. Although we will be working to try to increase that as we go along and it permits. One of the areas I wanted to definitely point out is reserve status at year end, which is the 4th row from the bottom. As you'll see, because the way we've been able to make do is we're using a lot of the reserve funds to fund those capital projects, which are quite large and coming up. As you see, we basically depleted as of the year end of 2022. And as a result, the capital projects have been reduced by the amount of just the contribution and the portion of the requisition that goes toward capital currently, to drop those capital projects down to lower amounts in 2023 and 2024. And then as you can see in the last row there, the unfunded 20-year capital, it shows as we're doing the projects, the amount of capital that's unfunded decreases for the first few years and then starts to grow as we don't have adequate funding moving forward long term. As a result, through that work, West Shore has it marked for 2020 is to work on an asset management program, looking just for some of the grant funding that should be announced pretty soon, to do something similar to what all the municipalities have been doing that you're familiar with, so that we can get something together to ensure that we can present back to the owners to get that long-term capital funding dealt with, so that we don't run into any issues moving down the road as aging infrastructure and so on. So, and that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to go the normal procedure and go to the public. Nope. I'll bring it to the table. There's a couple comments that I'd just like to make first, just before we move on. First of all, I just want to be very clear. I just circled it. So our lift is 0.67, correct? So looking to our manager of finance, I know for the last couple of years we have been putting 2% away when the contract was at 0. So we're anticipating that 0.67 will just be funded out of that fund. Is that correct? Or do we expect that this is going to be from taxation?
We intend, and the financial plan has been drafted, that this would be funded through taxation. The draft financial plan proposes again a 2% lift, which funds the requisition as has been presented tonight, and also sets aside approximately $90,000 for purposes of sustainable infrastructure replacement.
So no, well, thank you, but I guess I'm going to come back to you. And so my understanding, and it was also on the previous council. So when we ran into this situation where we were having a 0% budget with West Shore Park and Rec, this council made a decision that we were going to still continue to fund it 2% above that and put it into a reserve, so that when the new contract was signed, we wouldn't see the same hit that the other municipalities would see, because we were putting away that 2% that we knew we would eventually catch up. So I don't understand why this 0.67 is not being reflected as that we're now taking it out of the reserve to pay for this, because that's what the intent was to begin with.
Conversations that have occurred have suggested that that funding could be used for purposes of infrastructure replacement in the future, recognizing that, as West Shore Parks and Rec have just acknowledged, come 2022, those reserve funds are diminished.
I'm sorry, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm talking about our funds. I'm not talking about West Shore Park and Rec's funds. Like, do we have a reserve for West Shore Park and Rec for that 2% that we were putting away every year?
Yes.
So does that reserve not have a descriptor on what that money should be spent on, and wouldn't it naturally go to a lift?
The discussion around that reserve has not been to mitigate an operating requisition increase, but comments have been that that would be used for increases pertaining to reserves that haven't been set aside for infrastructure replacement. I can certainly revisit this and we can revise the draft.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't my understanding of that's how that was, but we can let committee decide or council decide. So thank you. I'll come to committee. Councillor Parkinson.
Thank you for that. It seems like you've been under some tough circumstances for a few years and have muscled your way through and, you know, running a tight ship from what it looks like here, which presumably you would have done anyway, but
Yeah.
maybe you were forced into it. My question is, of all the different operating areas down there, do you sort of have a look at each and every one and sort of go, you know, this one is about where we'd expect it to be, it's, you know, where users pay enough of it that it's about right, and this one's the real dog, you know, I'm thinking, you know, I'd be amazed if the lawn bowling was a big revenue generator. You know, food services may be one. I just wonder if you do that and if you analyze those, and I guess it was that kind of thinking that got rid of the curling rink and got the sports court. And have you done the same elsewhere? And are there
Yes.
similar items that you feel would be worthwhile or beneficial?
Yeah, exactly. And that was some of the process that was done with the board and the consultant. And that is how the curling was earmarked. It was the biggest cost and also not having a large amount of usage. We had some of the areas that have been looked at. Foods was looked at as well. They evaluated that at the time. It's been decided to leave it where it is, but we'll continue to evaluate foods as it is a challenging area. The lawn bowling, whereas it doesn't generate a lot of revenue, but also doesn't cost us a whole lot to run it either. And there's also a lot of infrastructure tied around it. So trying to reuse that, to repurpose that space could be quite challenging. And as well, it was indicated there amongst the 5 municipalities, there were some groups that were quite attached to that space. So that wasn't one of the ones that we were looked at. And it wouldn't have had a very large impact overall because of that the total net cost of that facility. As far as curling, the turnaround is quite significant because once you put in the facility we've got in there now, the cost to run it is quite small as compared to running an arena, and the usage is quite high because we've got lots of different sports groups and so on.
And I guess the other one that sort of I wonder about is the golf course, and if it comes close to paying for itself. Or
It does, yeah. It actually makes a little bit, not much. It used to do better. The hope now is we've made some changes where through the winter we have a pay machine instead of staffing the pro shop, which has made a big difference. So last year through the 4 months of the winter at the end of 2018 into 2019, we netted $15,000 off of that versus I honestly can't remember what the cost was, but it definitely cost. There wasn't enough rounds to cover the cost of having a staff there. And now we've got that machine running through, which runs from the beginning of November to the end of February.
Touch. All right. Never know what to do with these microphones these days. So I was looking at your per capita costs. Where you have the municipality, the 2020 requisition per capita.
Yes.
And then on the next slide, the regional operating comparatives, there's also a per capita, and I'm confused between one is like Colwood's in the second one is 38.75, and it's quite a bit more in the other one.
Yeah. Sorry. So, oops, wrong way. On here, this is our requisition per capita per resident, where the bottom portion here is your actual budget. So the Colwood Parks budget, excluding West Shore, costs the taxpayer $38.75. The portion of it's $59 is the portion per resident of West Shore's piece. The two separated.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So on here, so this slide here is the cost per capita of the portion you pay to West Shore. On the bottom of this slide is the cost per capita of your park services, basically, because there's not much of the where are your recreation side as far as I know. So the parks budget for Colwood is $709,000, or it was in 2019, and that cost per resident is $38.75 for just the parks. Yeah, I'm not sure what it's called.
So,
Yes, yeah, if you combine it together, it would be, so 40, about $100 a resident to do Parks and Rec, everything, yes.
Thank you, Worship. I really appreciate the comment you made about the sustainable infrastructure replacement funding and plan that you're going to be looking at over the next coming years. My question, do you anticipate any new opportunities perhaps in the next 5 years that would require West Shore Parks and Rec to administer new space? And I'm thinking with the construction of the new schools, municipalities, Langford, Colwood, may be partnering to upgrade the fields, like Royal Bay, as an example, and where those costs to administer may be included in the 5-year plan.
Yeah, we haven't had anything in there at this point. One of the areas that we've looked at so far, which I believe they've come around, is a skate park. That's one of the big drivers are looking at trying to do. So we're going to put that into, just move through the board to get that into our 5-year plan, beginning with the 2021 budget, as well as now moving with the changes we're doing with the childcare and whatnot should hopefully then lead to some of that extra need that's coming as more families are moving in with those different infrastructure. But I think it's just something we'll evaluate. We have a lot of different committees that work with the school district, work with the health organizations and whatnot, and we'll just continue with that dialogue and try to make sure that where we can work with them.
Do we know if if those fields like the Royal Bay field is a moneymaker for West Shore Parks and Rec? Because I can't imagine that's too much to administer. But
As far as on the rental pieces for Royal Bay, I'm just going to defer quickly, but I believe school district receives those funds.
do they?
Yeah.
we only get 35, we get the 35% on the
Yeah.
parking fee off of them. But on the agreement we made up front, they take all the revenue off the fields. Even though Colwood put in a chunk of change, we put in a chunk of change. And actually JDF Soccer paid for the lighting
Yes.
that's on them. But we looked at it as it was a service to the community, kind of like
Okay.
it's another rec facility. Like working with the schools is a good way to go. It's definitely,
Absolutely.
it's not a profit center for us, but
No, I agree. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Wade. Appreciate
Thanks,
that.
Wade.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks. You mowed my grass a little bit. I made a note to myself on the skate park. We had a great presentation here. We've, I believe, got some funds squirreled away for this, and maybe just tell us what the plan is or a time frame or.
Oh, sorry, you get the other guy.
Yeah, you can. Right now, so we've got a staff member who's working with the Skate Coalition. We've received 4 of the 5 owner municipalities have agreed or have mentioned they're going to be putting in the work to cover the portions that are related to 50% of the costs. We're going to be putting that into the capital plan to hopefully do that project in 2022 is the goal right now, with in essence that it will be done once funding is secured, and a combination of grants. They've been work with Kiwanis has set aside some money for it, and so they're getting some tracking now with some of the different community organizations, and so we're hoping that and the reason we put in 2022 is in 2021 we have the work on the JDF floor as well as we have the childcare space going in, and so if it works out, we potentially could try to do it sooner. It's just a matter of trying to figure out with staff resources and so on when the best time to do that.
Got you. And along the lines of what Gord asked, there some of those other bits and pieces in the building. Thinking like the the lounge above the curling rink. Is that going to the childcare space? Oh, okay, gotcha.
That entire upper floor is going to all be all related to childcare space. So we'll have a daycare, preschool's going in there, after school care, and then when they're not in there, that space can be used for other programs as well.
And will that include the space over top of the arena there too? That the big room around the corner at the back
Yes.
there? Yeah, it's all childcare. Eh?
Yeah, and it'll be divided into separate spaces.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I know it's been a really tough 4 years for West Shore Parks and Rec, so kudos for getting through all of the change management that you've had to do. And I wanted to just offer that I really appreciate that you're hiring someone to help with the role that Recreation Integration Victoria used to perform, because that is a really important service, and I know West Shore Parks and Rec has been one of the largest destinations for assistive equipment, and really makes a huge difference. So really appreciate that you didn't let that one slide through the cracks, despite that it's been a really challenging time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Grant.
Okay, thank you.
We are then going to move on to 5 unfinished business, which is the 2020 to 2024 draft financial plan, operating budgets, service plans.
All right, so tonight will be a continuation on. We will revisit 3 service plans, that for policing, recreation, and we'll also revisit the corporate services service plan just to have a conversation regarding the fee-for-service arrangements that are proposed. We'll then move on to the special projects, and we'll review those by each functional area, starting with corporate services, and we'll then move over to our capital plan. And we'll address that by each asset type, starting with road infrastructure. Any business that we don't finalize first review of tonight, we'll move to the next scheduled committee of the whole meeting, which is for Tuesday, March 10th. So with policing, I believe everyone has received a copy of the West Shore Detachment's policing update was circulated earlier this week. Now, last year, Council endorsed approval of moving the RCMP strength up 1 FTE position for 2019 and then an additional FTE position for 2021. The draft financial plan before you has moved that second position forward. So they're looking for that in 2020. And in addition, we're looking for a third FTE position strength for 2021. That's with respect to the policing strength. And then with the administrative municipal support staff, this budget before you proposes an additional 1.5 FTEs, 1 full FTE for 2020, and then a half a position starting 2021. And similar with recent years, we are trending to come in under budget. So while the RCMP, their complement did increase to the equivalent of 17.6 with unpaid leaves, sick leaves, etc., we are expecting to generate a surplus here of approximately $250,000 or so. This was highlighted earlier in 2019, and we have a council resolution to use this to fund the RCMP detachment repairs that were approved under last year's financial plan. And we've spent approximately $270,000 in 2019. And as we get into the capital program, you'll see that there is some additional spend proposed for the detachment building moving forward 2020 and into 2021. Are there any questions regarding the proposed policing budget?
I have a couple. Can you, first of all, looking under new operating budget, so it suggests, and I'm sure I'm misreading this, it says increased police strength 1.0 at $67,000. There's no way we're paying for an officer for $67,000. And then we're paying $90,000 for a support staff member? That seems awful expensive.
The police strength, as proposed in the financial plan, is split equally between 2020 and 21, and then 2021 and 2022. So between 2020 through to 2022, if we look to on page 42, it shows the transition of the full-time equivalent for the policing strength, but it's moving from 17.6 to 19.6 over the course of the 2 years. So what we saw in 2019 was we didn't move to that additional 1.0 FTE until very late in their year. Their fiscal year is slightly different from ours. And so that's why we're proposing that we will only need 50% of the funding for our calendar year 2020. We'll move to the additional 50% of the funding for 2021.
Okay, thank you. And what has there been any advice from the RCMP in regards to them unionizing, and that we should be building a contingency to fund to offset a lift in future years with that contract negotiation?
Yes, we've had some conversations. We do include within our contracted policing services $75,000 per year to fund the retro pay that we are now seeing under the contract.
Okay, thank you. I will come to council, or excuse me, committee. Anyone? Councilor Parkinson.
I guess this is a good time just to double check my understanding. So on the line item, increase police strength 1.0, where you put in 67,000 in 2020 and 71 in 2021, what that really says is you think he's going to be there for half of 2020, so that's half a year's cost, and that the 2021 cost will be the half year 67 that's then already in the budget forever, plus the 71 to cover the whole thing. So the full-time guy from 2021 on is 138,000.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, the intention of the new operating item is to show the incremental cost exactly as you described.
Good. Okay, just want to make sure I wasn't missing things again. The other question I had is last year we had quite a detailed presentation from Inspector Preston, and he had a whole bunch of details on how many cases there were and where they were and who paid what. And I think at this table it was fairly clear from what he presented that perhaps while we were pulling our weight and Langford was pulling its weight, that the province wasn't pulling its weight. And there was, as I understand it, a meeting with the province to say, listen, you guys aren't pulling your weight, at which time, and I wasn't at the meeting, but from what I recollect being told about it, was the province goes, well, that's because we don't calculate it that way. We have our own way to calculate it. And I'm wondering if that calculation by the province has been done or where it's at, and, you know, if the province is going to start pulling its weight, or we're just always going to be paying for more officers and they're not. Do we know?
I'm happy to answer it. So the province has said that you are absolutely right, that they do not agree with the formula that we presented to them. And then when asked to present the formula that they would agree to, they have not presented one to us. It's yeah.
And what are we doing about that? Just paying for more police officers forever?
We are waiting for the province to step up and provide it. I think, you know, to be fair and to be realistic, the province recognizes that and this is my opinion, the province recognizes that they are underfunding, but this has major ramifications for the entire province, not just the West Shore. And so they certainly do not want to be setting a precedent in the West Shore that they would have to live up to for the rest of the province.
So the province wouldn't want to be seen to be acting fairly towards municipalities? Is that?
Thank you. I just wanted to suggest, to do with the previous conversation, doesn't seem like we're getting any traction in trying to get the province to address the underfunding for the provincial component. But what is in the police RCMP report is their wait times when they have to apprehend somebody under the Mental Health Act. And it's taking, in many cases, in excess of 2 hours, where the RCMP have to wait with the person for service. And that might be a place where we could get the province to address the issue more readily and would help a great deal with staffing getting back to the West Shore.
Thank you, Worship. I have some insight into these matters, but I do know we need to be careful that this ask from the inspector pertains to our community and our statistics for call loads, and he's done a thorough job flushing it out, as would be expected. And we are seeing an increase in that clinical sense. So he's quick to separate the provincial positions from those officers that are dedicated to our communities in the West Shore. So it is, although it's apples, it's apples and a different kind of apple as far as comparison goes with the provincial positions. Now, yes, you can make an argument if the province properly staffed their side of the ledger, that those forces would be available to assist when something happens and there was further assistance needed. But the reality is this ask is based upon our statistics. I have asked the inspector to flush it out over a number of years because we all know that 1 year with fluctuation in these statistics is not in and of itself reliable, but he's done it over multiple years, and it's clear that we're trending upwards. And I have every reason to believe that will continue as more doors come to completion this year, latter part of this year and next year. Further, I see that he's assigned that ask as a further constable to E-Watch. And E-Watch is very interesting and novel on their part, and I think they're one of only 1 or 2 detachments that are actually working like this, and they run a mid-watch to cover peak periods, and that's E-Watch. So you have your 4 A through D, and then you have your E-Watch, which supplements peak periods. So he's trying to be productive with resources allotted to him. So I think there's a lot of novel things going on here, and I do think that it's a reasonable ask. It's not 10 officers all at once, it's a couple over a few years. And my understanding is with these 2 or 3 officers that we are good for the coming few years, and that some of this was catch up from past council. So I fully endorse this, and I think it's reasonable over a couple of year period like it's been mapped out here.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next topic. Want to keep this moving.
We're on page 66 of the draft financial plan pertaining to recreation, culture, and heritage. We will have the Greater Victoria Public Library in attendance at the next committee meeting, March 10th. Their draft budget is showing a 3.9% requisition increase, but our budget impact, Colwood's share, our proportionate share has decreased, and so we're looking at a 0.4% increase. And this is for our Greater Victoria Public Library requisition, and we'll get further details at the next meeting. So the West Shore Parks and Rec Society, so we just heard Grant's thorough presentation there. So overall, the requisition has increased 3.4%. Our share has increased approximately 1.56%. Our budget reflects a 2% increase over what we budgeted last year. Now, since the requisition had remained frozen in each of 2018 and 2019, the city did elect to increase our funding pertaining to recreation. And what we have been doing is setting aside the difference between what the requisition has been each year and what we've been taxing. And that's been set aside in a reserve. We've had conversations in the last couple of years that funding is intended for infrastructure. It's intended for capital infrastructure related to recreation. This is the city's funding, and we would specifically address the use of that funding by way of a reserve bylaw update that is coming forth in 2020. So for now, we have set aside that funding. That funding has not been proposed to mitigate a lift pertaining to the annual operating requisition. And so this year, we have kept the lift at 2%, and that allows for approximately $90,000 to again be set aside for purposes of infrastructure funding, not for purposes of the requisition. And lastly, the Heritage Commission, we have approximately $13,000 in annual funding. We didn't incur any expenditures in 2019, in part, getting the commission sort of reestablished and back up and running. We expect that will be some funding for initiatives coming out of the commission. And happy to answer any questions on any of those areas.
He's drunk with power. I just wondered, since we didn't incur any costs in 2019 for the Heritage Commission, was there money set aside in a reserve fund for activities in the future?
There hasn't been. By way of council resolution, we certainly could set aside those unspent tax dollars.
Okay, thank you.
I guess the same question on the recreation center, the unspent monies or the 2% lift. That's not in a specified reserve fund. That's in surplus.
That has been set aside in reserves. Draw your attention to have a look at page 74. We've just referred to it as West Shore Parks and Rec Society. And we will be providing further detail on how that reserve could be specifically structured by bylaw through our reserve fund bylaw update that will be coming later this quarter.
Okay, well, I can probably wait for that, but it just seems a little complex to be in a 5-party arrangement for us to be putting money aside in reserves if others aren't, and how does that match? Like, I guess I just worry about them being too specifically isolated, but we'll talk about that when the reserve fund comes up.
If there's no further questions, we'll move back over to fee-for-service discussion for corporate services. And I did want to draw your attention to one correction. We are now on page 28. Under new operating budget items, the intention here is to highlight the additional funding asks. The green teams of Greater Victoria, The city is in a current fee-for-service arrangement that provides $5,000 per year. The draft financial plan has increased this budget to $7,500 per year to fund one additional event. So that increase should show as $2,500, not $1,500 for the Green Teams of Greater Victoria. Certainly. So starting on page 28, but we're now on the bottom of page 29, which summarizes the new operating items for corporate services. And so in total, between the city's grant and aid and fee for service, we have budgeted $160,800. Included in that is a budget of $23,000 for purposes of crossing guard funding. This is moving from funding 2 to 3 crossing guards at the 3 elementary schools previously discussed. In addition, there's $43,300 for grant and aid funding. And there's $94,500 proposed for fee-for-service arrangements. And those arrangements are $12,000 annually for the West Shore Chamber of Commerce, $7,500 for the Green Teams of Greater Victoria, and $75,000 for Pacific Center for Family Services Association for purposes of their community outreach, prevention, and education program. The 5-year plan factors in a 2% lift for each of those organizations for each of the 5 years. As was mentioned earlier in budget deliberations, committee may wish to make a recommendation on these fee-for-service arrangements at this time, or this can be revisited.
So the amounts that you mentioned aren't in the document, is that right?
The amounts that I just mentioned in sum are included within the draft financial plan. It's the sum of, so on page 29 under the core operating expenses, we have grant and aid and fee for service of $125,300. And then
I'm lost. I had you at the bottom of the page with the new operating budget items, and then you went someplace else and I lost you. Middle of the page?
so just up above that is a table on page 29 still.
Okay.
So that's the core operating budget for corporate services. And the last line item under operating expenses, grant and aid and fee for service.
Okay.
So we had a core budget of $125,300. And then we've had 3 proposed new items that are increasing that budget. The crossing guard increase, the proposed increase for the Greater Victoria Green Team, and Pacific Center Family Services proposed increase.
Yeah, just that I just don't see the increases on the page. Are they not there, or?
Under new budget operating items, the next table down on page 29.
Okay. But you said 75,000 for Pacific Center. Mine says 25,000.
The 25,000 represents the increase. We're currently funding that organization approximately 50,000 a year.
Now I get it. All right, thank you. I'm with you now.
Did I catch you saying that the Green Team increase of $2,500 was for one additional event?
Yes, and also recognition. So currently, the city provides $5,000. That $5,000 is an estimate of our 50-50 cost-sharing arrangement with that organization. Feedback from works performed in 2019 was that costs are a little bit higher than that than the $2,000 per event. So they have requested $7,500 in total for 6 events.
And their costs are, they have a couple of organizers that show up and provide some snacks, is that? Well, I'm sure they are, so why?
They will have overhead costs. I don't have the specifics at my fingertips.
Thank you. I only see 1,500 for the increase, and I thought you said 25.
I did moments ago. I said that was a correction.
Oh,
that
okay.
It simply displayed incorrectly. The total budget does reflect the additional 2,500, but the 1,500 will be updated in the next version of this document.
No problem. I just wanted to make sure I got it right.
So with that, we'll move over to the city's special projects. So again, these projects, primarily operating projects that represent initiatives outside of our core operations. And for the most part, these are tied to the city's strategic priorities. These projects are funded primarily by way of reserve or surplus. If a project is deferred or the full budget is not required, that funding is simply retained within the respective surplus or reserve. And so starting on page 30, we'll now review the special projects for corporate services. So the city initiates a citizen survey every 2 to 3 years. The last survey was performed in 2017, and the next one is scheduled for 2020. We're on page 30. And I'll just comment, these slides are not reflected in the agenda. So on page 30 of the draft financial plan, it's the same information, just displayed slightly differently. So on the slide, moving over to the far right, we've got highlighting the reference to the city's strategic priorities, so mobility, governance, vibrancy, etc. So moving down from the citizen survey, the city has set aside funding for City Hall space planning. So this was endorsed under the 2019 to 23 financial plan, but it was works that was proposed for 2021. We are looking at doing that work this year, and it represents the engagement of a third-party space planner to provide layout and design detail to accommodate whether it's meeting space, office, desk spaces as required. And perhaps I'll just go through each one and then jump to questions. We set aside funding for corporate contingency, $150,000. Should we anticipate the need for this funding, we would make mention of that before council. And we do comment on this throughout each quarterly report back. The city also sets aside fundings for purposes of First Nation outreach. We have secured a $10,000 UBCM grant, and we intend to use that to fund events that we have scheduled for this year. Our strategic priorities plan identified a couple of tactics that are the 3 that follow. So a cultural needs assessment, a household prosperity survey, as well as a compensation review. And lastly, the West Shore Skate Park contribution was touched on earlier by West Shore Parks and Rec Society. Committee had indicated funding of approximately $99,000. So we have included that in the financial plan. And again, final decisions have not yet been made on that, but if and when they are, we'll have the authority under the financial plan to make that contribution. Happy to answer any questions pertaining to these special projects.
We have a member from the public. Any comments? Seeing none, then I will go. Councillor Jensen.
Thank you. Cultural needs assessment. Help me out.
So this is one of the strategic priorities. Cultural needs, and we're talking about a community and cultural needs assessment. So part of this is driven by the conversation about a performing arts center, that kind of thing. But also just to understand the social needs of our community and round out our understanding to inform decision making when it comes to social programs, arts and culture programs, heritage programs. Robert may have more on that.
Thank you. Yeah, so fundamentally, social assessments, community social assessments are typically broken into two parts, one quantitative and one qualitative. And so the quantitative aspect looks at existing statistics and tries to get an understanding at the household level of what's going on in our community. The second half is more qualitative and seeks to gain understanding from our community members about the social side of the health of this community, again, at the household level. It will work to inform both programming and tactics that council could use over the next few years to help improve quality of life across the organization and quantify when organizations such as Pacific Family come to council seeking support for particular programming, having direct understanding of what our community perspectives are with respect to their needs is the intended use of this work.
Sounds good.
Rationalize for me corporate contingency. We have obviously a bunch of money sitting in reserves that presumably council could elect to pull out if some big thing came along that we needed for. So why would we pull out $150,000 to sit, and if we don't use it, put it back in contingency? Or, you know, why, yes, things could come up that require money, but we're saying it's reserved except with council permission, which I think is pretty much the same for all the money that sits in reserves.
Corporate contingency is funded by way of our surplus, so not explicit use of reserves funding. And ultimately, the reason that we elect to include this line item is that so should the unexpected occur and we are unable to fund it by way of savings elsewhere, we don't have to amend our financial plan bylaw. The reason that staff make the statement that we would have full transparency with use of this funding is simply just that it's contingency funding where we haven't specified the use. If the unexpected arises, and we do expect that we would need that funding, we would make mention of that to council.
So I think I saw this coming on a new construction revenue. Is that correct? And if I guess if we didn't pull it out and say it's for corporate contingency, we could just as easily put it into the reserve, overall operating reserves or some other reserve fund that would be just as accessible without having that number, without anything tagged to it.
This is not funded by way of new construction taxation. This is funded by way of accumulated surplus, so unspent previous year's taxation dollars. And again, made mention in the financial plan so that should the unexpected arise, we don't require a financial plan bylaw amendment. The alternative is to not have a contingency should the unexpected arise and the funding is not available. We would come forth with a financial plan bylaw amendment.
I guess I haven't seen a financial plan amendment. Are they humongous big things to do, or? And if you're saying it's not coming out of new taxation revenue, it's coming out of reserves, and it's in reserves now. So I'm not sure I follow.
The city accumulates surplus annually, certainly in recent years, often as a result of staffing turnover. That surplus is available as a funding source. This does commit $150,000 of that surplus for purposes of funded contingency.
Sorry, it might be nomenclature, but the staff consider accumulated surplus different from a reserve. Reserves are set aside and dedicated for a purpose, whereas the accumulated surplus has no dedication.
Just
Go away a second, I get tired of this, so this is the least job. Sorry, hold on. Darn it. Sorry.
I just have to say that this reminds me of our discussions last year when we talked about pulling money out of the affordable housing plan. We didn't know what we were going to do with it, but it'd be nice to have it handy. We would take it out, and if we didn't use it, it would always be there and available. And within a month, we had, oh, here's where something to do with the money, and poof, it was gone. I just, you know, I worry about money that's not tagged for anything, just sitting there, that it's easily to be used. But, you know, up to council, I guess.
Thank you. And I'm in a similar quandary. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the household prosperity survey. So reading through our West Shore RCMP detachment report, it's quite obvious there's lots of domestic violence issues and social issues that Pacific Centre Family Services does provide services to assist with. So I'm not sure why we're spending the $60,000 for the cultural needs assessment instead of simply providing services that we know are needed in the community. So can you help me a little bit understand it better?
Sorry, I can try to answer. You know, from my perspective, organizations that I've worked with every term of office, or every 4 or every 3 years historically, have gone through a process to try to quantify just what's ailing the community from a social perspective, and or to turn that's on its head, what the municipality could do in terms of supporting programs and services from a social perspective to be most effective at helping the community. And so each individual councillor and or each individual who's involved in a program or a service such as Pacific Family has kind of their perspective on where the municipality might focus its resources. This is an attempt for the municipality to create an independent view of that is both qualitative and quantitative. And so in a perfect world, statistically defendable resource that council could use over time. In the absence of this, council could certainly use the advice that you get from all the various service sector groups in the community to help guide the direction. That's the community social assessment. The household prosperity survey is something slightly different, and that's to kind of gather qualitative data from households to understand what's affecting their financial prosperity at the household level? Is it that daycare is too expensive, or is it that they're having to work so many jobs they don't have time to recreate, or is it that they can't find a good paying job locally, or is it that they are having to spend too much time commuting such that they can't lead a meaningful and interesting life? And so the household prosperity survey is an attempt to try to understand, again, at the household level, what is getting in the way of people from being more prosperous than they like to be. And then an opportunity for the municipality to determine whether or not there is direct or indirect things that we could do to help people, household by household.
So if we do this, I would imagine that there's probably intervals in which this needs to be done. So how often would this occur?
In my experience, once a term makes sense. It gives a group of elected officials an opportunity to look at the results and make a determination about how you might use tactics to try to change some of the results. But depending on what you discover, you may determine that more frequent or less frequent is needed in a given situation. In a community that is growing very fast, it may be that a more frequent review of household needs is warranted.
Thank you.
So I think I started in roughly the same place you did, Councillor Day. I think the presentation we had the other day from Pacific Family was quite moving, and you could see, the need. You can see it in the RCMP statistics, and then you think back to the grants and aid that we were giving out to organizations that were trying to do something, and during the presentation for Family Services, I had to reflect to go, well, gee, maybe we should have given them a little more money and not to these other people that are doing similar things, like who does it better and who's the right people. And it's hard for me to really come to grasp with. I mean, with how much money of other people's money should I be giving to these people? And I do believe some. So I'm quite supportive of this cultural and social strengths assessment, and let's see where it takes us.
So moving over to emergency services, we do have a special project proposed for the next 3 years. So the Colwood Fire Department will be working with View Royal Fire to further develop and enhance our emergency services program. And this funding represents the engagement with View Royal for approximately a day a week as we work together to enhance our plan. And sorry, I should make mention, this is on page it's just included in the summary on page 24 under Fire Department for Emergency Services Program Development.
Sorry, are you done? That was it? Okay.
Sorry, that,
All right. Chief, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, if I may, I would love to speak to this, Your Worship, member of council. This is a direction that stemmed from several conversations with the CEO's office and how we move forward with our emergency program. With the anticipation of Jeff Amy retiring coming up in the next little bit. He's been running this program for quite a number of years. And how do we move forward and plan and grow our emergency program? It was decided that what we could do was change the governance so it falls under the governance of the fire department and the fire chief's office. The next step would be to bring in and bring in the dedicated resources and fund the dedicated resources of a member of the View Royal Fire Department who is a part-time firefighter and part-time emergency program manager, name of Troy Mullen. So this roughly $26,000 would contract services for Troy to assist in the development and plotting forward of the overall emergency program for the city of Colwood. Not just emergency operation functions, but review hazard assessments, development of specific plans, things like that. So this is contract price that we've worked out, similar to the plan that we have right now for ESS services. We run a joint combined ESS program that's very successful for View Royal and Colwood. We're going to build on the successes that View Royal has built over the last 10 years on their program, get some of those ideas. So at the end of the 3-year program, then there will be a chance for council to decide how we move forward. Do we continue on with contract agreement with View Royal to provide this service to aid the city, or do we plot a new direction? Do we decide that no, we want to pick a different direction and other possible funding sources? So this is a direction moving forward, but there will be something coming forward for council to decide how this emergency program moves into the future past this 3-year window.
All right, thank you. Doesn't look like I have any discussion on it, so you did a good job. There you go.
All right, so moving along to the special projects for long-range planning. These are highlighted on page 50 and 51 of the draft financial plan. Starting with the land use bylaw update, this was identified under the 2019 financial plan, and the work has been deferred to 2020. And looking at doing work between 2020 and 2021 to update key components of both the land use bylaw and the Colwood sign bylaw. The Parks and Recreation Master Plan as well, this was identified under the 2019 financial plan. The city has gone out to request for proposal earlier this year on this project. That RFP has closed and submissions are currently being evaluated. The sidewalk and bike lane review, we're also referring to this as the Active Transportation Network Plan. So this is a new project identified under this financial plan. And this would be funding for a consultant to assist the city develop a sidewalk and bicycle network plan based on some of the information contained within our transportation master plan. The coastline studies, this is a placeholder budget to ensure there's funding available for technical support for the city's waterfront coastal committee. The demographics study, this is funding set aside to update the 2018 demographics study that the city undertook. And lastly, there's funding set aside for next year for low carbon resiliency plan. And I have the Director of Long Range Planning and Sustainability here to answer any specifics on these initiatives.
Thank you. I'm just curious about the sidewalk and bike lane review. Will that include some public engagement on the review?
Through the chair, absolutely. A critical component of this project will include an identification of priority projects. So in the strategic plan, it was made clear that a 10-year capital plan was an important component of this output project, of the project. So part of that would include extensive consultation with the community to determine where people want to see priority projects for sidewalks and bicycle infrastructure.
Great. I was with the Cycling Advisory Committee for many years, and one of the issues that has kind of slipped out of the plan is the maintenance of the bike and not so much the sidewalks, but it can be super dangerous, and certainly that was the feedback we heard from a number of active cyclists, that we really need to not only think about having the infrastructure, but ensuring that it's usable. So.
All right, so with that, we'll move along. Oh,
So we're kind of getting into the meat of the things, but I've been trying to sort of cross-reference what was planned for last year with what's planned now, and what's been done from last year and what hasn't been done now, and I have a little bit of trouble. You know, the land use bylaw update was budgeted for 130,000 last year and 35,000 in 2020. Now it's 130 and 130, so it seems like it hasn't happened for a year, and it's gone up significantly in cost. The sidewalk and bike lane review is I think probably part of the embarrassment of the city of Colwood is that there is a sidewalk plan was what, 2005, wasn't it, Gordy? Something that was done, that was sort of proposed to be done over the next 10 years and sort of hasn't happened, and now I think some of us have you know, really tried to highlight that you know, if we're going to make Colwood a city, it's got to have a few more sidewalks, and then try to get it happen, and so we're going to step back and study it again. You know, even I don't know about last year's projects, whether I think there were more in the engineering thing. There was some work on Machosen Road that was sort of slotted for last year and didn't happen. So I guess I'd kind of like to know what happened there. The coastline studies, you know, it's nice that there's some money to help on the waterfront committee. That's useful. Last year there was money set aside for, I believe, studying the north end of the spit and maybe some other work. So again, things seem to drop off as well as get added. It's not clear to me why. So we're sitting here talking about here's what we want to do, but nobody's saying last year we wanted to do all this stuff, but after thinking about it, we don't want to anymore. And then, you know, there's probably lots of good reasons. I guess my notes seem to think that what's been dropped from last year was a summer co-op student. I guess that's sort of, you don't need one, you don't need one. Transportation plan update, maybe that's somewhere else. I think we're still doing one somewhere. Climate score toolkit, maybe that rolls into the low carbon resiliency plan, but it's just, you know, when we do this, it would be nice to think that we're all on the same page and things are getting done. And I guess I don't think it's out of line to sort of say, if this was what was proposed last year, why didn't it happen, and why is what we're proposing this year so much better? So I guess that's just a rant, but.
Thank you. I'll tackle some of the questions, maybe not necessarily in the order they were asked, but please stop me if I get mixed up. So first off, the land use bylaw update, the increase that's in the 2020 budget and also 2021 is a reflection of the fact that there's a upzoning initiative proposed to be included in that. So all of this is stemming from Council's new strategic plan, which includes that upzoning initiative. So the two areas that would be included through Council direction is what's known as internally the Golden Triangle, bounded by Island Highway, Goldstream Avenue, and Whale Road. And also the lands designated within the OCP as the transit growth areas, primarily along the Sucro corridor. So that has been added to that project as a priority. The other changes that have come forth, as I said, are directly stemming from the strategic plan. We were in a stage of transition in 2019 with respect to changes in council and management and priorities with respect to long-range plans. So a lot of the work that long-range planning did was upgrading and reviewing existing policies as opposed to getting at these long-range plans that were crystallized around the new strategic plan.
I'll ask in a second. So, so can you tell me the land use bylaw update that was Councillor Parkinson brought up? That's now $260,000. When do we see that actually being finished? Since it's in a 2-year schedule.
Staff are looking at that project as really a grouping of separate projects that would tackle land use regulation and, as I said, the upzoning initiatives. The critical tasks as we see it for 2020 include a revision to our parking regulations as well as that upzoning initiative. We can be flexible in terms of what gets tackled as we move forward and certainly be responsive to council direction. But that's what we see as being the priorities for 2020.
So when do we expect that the parking and the upzoning will be complete?
By the end of this year.
Okay. Councillor Jensen.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. Along the same lines, I think I'll be the voice of our brother, Councillor Kobayashi. If these are not achievable and they're carrying over from year to year to year, let's carve it out and stuff the money into a savings account somewhere or a reserve fund or what have you. And I would like to see these things come forth with some kind of, Doug is always big on measurables, and I know he can't be here tonight, so what are our measurables and what is it we're looking to accomplish for this year as opposed to carrying things over year after year after year? Maybe it's not achievable in its current form. Maybe we have to tender it and ask for some help. Maybe we need more staff. And I get that we've had some staff turnovers in key places throughout the organization and some challenges, and that we're making some headway in that regard. But I would like to see, I guess this is more of a comment, I would like to see these things come forward with some kind of timeline. I'd hate to think that I'm sitting here looking at this bylaw again for another 130 grand next year, because by then it'll be 150 grand due to inflation. That's the end of my rant, Your Worship.
Your Worship, if I may, staff recognize Council's desire for more precision in administration's ability to forecast our capacity to do work and to get it done. So one of the tactics that we'll be bringing forward at one of the 2 meetings in March is, and it will be addended to every agenda, both Committee of the Whole and Council from that point forward, is something at this point in draft form is being called City of Colwood 2020 Long-Term Agenda. Right now there are 39 items. For each of the items, there's a specific quarter within 2020 when staff are endeavoring to get these back into chambers and or back to a committee and or back to a subcommittee. And as we get closer to the dates, we'll move off of it just suggesting Q2 or Q3 into the specific date of the meeting. The 39 items that are in the draft right now are the items that staff are of the belief, based on your recent adoption of the strategic plan, are the most important to you. And we recognize that throughout the year, and as conditions change externally, either politically or economically, things may change. And so the idea is that this is a living document, and if and when Council has a priority that needs to get in the way of some of these other priorities, that Council will give staff that direction live in a meeting, and the document, the agenda itself, will be amended such that Council and administration are both kind of working from the same scorecard, if you will, and that the scorecard is public. And so we're disclosing to all who will hear that this is our intended schedule to achieve. So we are working to get more precise. That said, I believe administration currently and administrations likely of the past have endeavored to achieve all that they've put forward. That said, certainly in the area of planning, current planning can never be accurately predicted. And when it comes in the door, often resources need to be poured in that direction. So we have a tactic coming that I hope will help alleviate some of the tension that I'm hearing in chambers tonight.
No further questions regarding long-range planning. We'll move along to engineering, development, and public works special projects. So the city has identified small lot subdivision guidelines. The objective here is to create guidelines to assist staff in working with the community and developers to create templates for consistent standards for small lot development. The DCC bylaw update is a project that is underway and will be back before council in the near future in 2020. And this is for the road DCC bylaw. And sorry, I should just...
Sorry, Jen. Yeah, could you tell us the page?
We're on page 60 and going into page 61 of the draft financial plan. Moving along, we have a project identified as engineering standards and specifications. This was previously approved under the name subdivision bylaw update. And this is the city's current bylaw dates from 1995 and requires updating. The transportation master plan, which was previously touched on, we have that incorporated into the financial plan with spend proposed for both 2020, $50,000 reflecting an update and initial refresh to the plan, as well as a more comprehensive update planned for 2022. And this is under the city's strategic priorities timing. We have work underway and continuing into 2020 for drainage flow monitoring. Rock face monitoring. Works have not yet started, but we are looking to initiate those works in 2020. And before moving over to the next slide, these projects span a couple of slides, but perhaps we'll just pause there and take any questions on those first 6 projects.
You didn't. Actually, that's great. Looks good. The only question of rock face monitoring, do you monitor rock faces on private property that might fall onto public property, or you just look at rock faces on public property?
Through the chair, yes, it's intended to be anyone that interface with the public lands. So if we've got a trail, walkway, roadway, and it's maybe a privately held wall, we're still looking at that. However, the extent of the geotechnical investigation would probably be different. It'd be about recommendations to help that property owner manage and mitigate any fall onto ours. We'd look at the catchment boundaries at the bottom if it was a natural face, or the sort of typology of growth in and around it, and then work with the homeowner.
I'm curious about the drainage flow monitoring because I know of a number of very old drainage ways in Colwood that could easily be flying under the radar, if you will. And I'm just wondering, that's not a lot of money for doing a large area of Colwood. So is this only the big things first, or are you looking at big and little, or is there a long-term plan?
Through the chair, this is the commencement of a long-term plan, and I'm trying to carve the municipality up into quite literally, as you've described it, large scale, medium, and small scale. I'm dealing with those large systems flows right now, trying to understand those characteristics to ensure that the system capacities are in place. And then once those are reviewed, I'm going to work into the more minor systems thereafter. We'd always be welcome to recommendations of hot areas from your personal knowledge.
Right. So, yeah, my personal experience has been that when some areas have developed and a lot of trees have come down, the following year there is a tremendous increase in the amount of groundwater runoff in the area. So I think that it might make a lot of sense to look at areas where changes are occurring.
I guess maybe because you're here, Brent, I noticed in the last year's budget, the coastline erosion study for 50,000, 32,000 talked about phase 1 was done. Phase 2 was initiated by a master's student. Will include a risk analysis and protection plan for Ocean Boulevard from the pump station to Perimeter 2 Park. And phase 3 includes risk analysis and protection plan for bridge approaches and abutments. Was any of that done? Or is it, and I don't see it in this year's budget.
The study by Royal Roads was concluded. It did provide recommendations in terms of the bridge, but they were only minor. Those results should be with the committee, and I forgot the name, the coastal committee. And frankly, the recommendations of that committee will help form some of the decisions on how to go forward. This year, we're looking at doing the minimum and routine maintenance that we need to do on the bridge so that we can move forward into the long-term plan and objectives for that entire coastal road and access way.
Okay, I mean, I see there's some money in the long-range planning, but it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. Do you do the studies and provide the data to the committee, or does the committee look at it and say, here's the work we need? So that's all right. We'll figure it out.
So just continuing on, with respect to, we made mention at the previous meeting about the city's efforts to enhance GIS services. We are proposing a spend for 2021 for updated orthographic photos for what will be our updated GIS system. We are proposing a buildings and facilities condition assessment for 2020, which would be a review of the current condition of our facilities with respect to, HVAC, roof, the building envelope, etc. Latoria Road geotechnical works and Latoria Creek environmental works. We touched on this in a presentation to council early last month. So this again is funding to determine the existing conditions and potential work required to upgrade Latoria Road and to review what significant geotechnical works would be required. In addition, an environmental review of the Latoria Creek to assess the aquatic habitat. Sewer master plan update is proposed for 2020. The city last reviewed its sanitary sewer master plan in 2013, and so this budget would be to update the plan and provide recommendations in regards to both maximum flow potentials and system limits relative to septic conversion and life cycle costing for the city's sewer infrastructure. And lastly, we have a proposed spend for sanitary sewer investigation and monitoring. So our sanitary flows are monitored by the CRD, and we're showing portions of the system experiencing what we call I&I, inflow and infiltration. And so this budget is to review specific areas of the city to determine where this I&I is occurring. And that brings us both to the end of special projects for the organization, and in particular engineering, development, and public works. If there are any questions.
I just wanted to confirm, I think we talked about the I&I issues with the sewers before, and that is being funded through the sewer users?
Yes, this is going to be funded by way of the sewer operating surplus that has been driven by the sewer user fee.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to make a comment in regards to the sewer master plan update, which is $150,000, and it says that it's looking at, pardon me, cost estimates of extending sewer service throughout Colwood. And I just want to remind everyone that there are a number of septic systems that work very well and very affordable for people. And I want to ensure that people aren't forced to join the sewer system if they don't want to.
You guys can talk too, but actually that's good, happy with all that. The sewer master plan update does kind of make me think a little bit. I mean, there's a sewer master plan that's not that old, hasn't been that much sewer put in since it was built, I wouldn't have thought. And I, for one, am not in favor of sewering all of Colwood. I think that there's lots of Colwood that septic fields should work forever for a long, long time, and there's some real advantages. There may be some regulatory things that the city could address on replacing and upgrading septic fields without perhaps the going to the extent that I guess some would like, with very expensive systems on perfectly good ground that works well. So I'm unclear that the necessity to update the sewer master plan, although there are things to talk about within the sewer system. So, and then again, we talk about, little sort of one-pagers on what's involved in all these studies, so that we at the council table can understand and perhaps put our input in early rather than sending people off on the wrong tangent. So I guess that's my hope, would be that there would be a chance for some input before this went out and just updated the existing sewer master plan.
Thank you very much, because it gives me the chance to respond to that. So previously, when we talked about the sewer system and respecting Councillor Day's comments, the intention of this update is to bring forward all of the series of reports that are going to be coming forward this year by mid-2020. So within this first quarter, start of second quarter, we're going to bring forward a present capacity consideration for our present usage of our sewer relevant to the CRD's capacity allotment for the city. That's going to be brought forward in relation to the CRD's intent to improve that capacity over the course of the entire system. Then the CRD will come in and present their bylaw implications for bringing in a sewer specified development cost charge on the benefit of the CRD. Then we're going to couple into that the I&I discussion. And frankly, the intent of this update is to bring forward all of that, but also in line with the comments about where is sewer most appropriate in the city, respective of good ground conditions, areas where we don't have issues, and frankly costs. There's portions of our city that's very expensive to sewer because of pumping necessities that are on great ground. That has not formed part of the present consideration in our master plan, which is to sewer Colwood. So it's to bring forth the reasons and then allow the input through the series of updates that we're planning to do by mid-2020, and then to bring form and function to how to formulate this in terms of the best system with some choices for council.
So with that, we'll proceed to the city's capital program, a review of the 5-year proposed spend. And so if you turn to page 77, so the chart on the bottom of page 77 there summarizes our total spend for each of the next 5 years and highlights the funding source. So the city's capital, typically funded by way of reserves or through grant funding. Again, similar with special projects, if the project's deferred or the full budget's not required, that funding is retained within the respective surplus or reserve. We'll proceed now with an overview of our capital program. So the ongoing programs will highlight capital expenditures that were previously authorized and have either been deferred or are underway. And then we'll get into the new capital expenditures. And we'll get started with road infrastructure. And so this here starts on page 78. So we have a number of ongoing capital programs for purposes of our road infrastructure. Starting with, we maintain annual funding for pedestrian bridges and large culverts. We have highlighted separately works on Esquimalt Lagoon Bridge. We have an LED streetlight upgrade program. So the city's in the process of upgrading streetlights, and we set aside gas tax grant funding for this purpose annually. Similarly, traffic calming, we set aside some gas tax funding for this purpose. And we look to our traffic calming policy to identify and prioritize spend under this program. The city has funding set aside annually for signage and wayfinding. In addition to this budget here of approximately $20,000 a year, we've also set aside about $35,000 over the next 3 years for purposes of park signage. Intentions in 2020 includes both an effort of establishing an overall inventory of city signs and then starting to work our way through where we need signs or the need for replacement. And these would both, not just on wayfinding, but also safety measures. The city established a paving program in recent years. So we do set aside funding by way of taxation into reserves, and then it is available for purposes of capital paving projects throughout the city. The bike lane program and the sidewalk program, these are new programs that are being proposed for 2021 and beyond. And consistent with the paving program would be funded by way of our sustainable infrastructure. And lastly, we're looking at introducing what's being referred to as a crosswalk improvement program. And we do have specific spend identified for 2020. And that is for the installation of 3 pedestrian activated solar powered crosswalk lights at Herm Williams Park, Souk and Machosen Road, and Latoria and Wishart Road. And with that, that's an overview of the ongoing programs, and we'll take pause for questions.
I'd like to go back to page 77 for a moment and talk about under the capital program summary, looking at under funding sources. For 2020, I feel quite comfortable, and it's great that we're taking it out of reserves and we're able to fund some of that capital. I'm concerned about 2021, though, that we have a $4.1 million of debt that we're planning on taking on, and I certainly would like to have a discussion about that.
Absolutely. So when we get over to the sewer infrastructure, that proposed debt financing is for the potential move of the Ocean Boulevard pump station, and we will certainly have a conversation at that time.
Thank you. On back to the next page under road infrastructure, I noticed that we have nothing in 2020 for bike lanes or sidewalk program, and I also noticed that under previously approved Machosen Road improvements, and it has in brackets Cotlow, 5,000 this year and 500,000 next year, and I'd just like to know more about what that is for.
Certainly, we'll be moving on to, for now, we've just commented on what are the ongoing recurring spend, and we'll be moving on to what work is currently underway, which is that project there.
I'm sorry, it's in the 2021 budget, so you want to talk about it later?
We can certainly speak about it right now. It's coming up on the next slide.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, and just wondering, nothing for bike lanes or sidewalks this year?
Through the chair, you'll see as we start working through some of the intended projects for this year that I'm trying to create some shelf-ready projects. The capacity to undertake new bike lane or sidewalk programs while we're under review of our infrastructure, bike lane necessity, and council, I believe, has expressed a desire to prioritize those works. Needs to first be brought back. I understand there's also going to be a committee structure as created. So what I'm working to create is that shelf-ready project objective as we continue working through it. That can be affected by both committee and council in terms of timing and objective. And that's the reason why I've pushed those off, is to allow that contemplation in this year. We can certainly reallocate or reallocate. And I do have a potential shelf-ready project for the painter Chosen Works.
Okay. So just off the top of my head, one of the things that has been much on everybody's mind, we've had a tough winter, everybody's talking about all the potholes, every municipality in the region is pretty much falling apart. And Wishart Road in particular is really taken a beating this year. It's been bad probably for a while, but we haven't got to it yet. And one of the things that happened was we put in sidewalk infrastructure as a result of developments that were taking place, which makes perfect sense. But unfortunately, when the sidewalks were put in, they put the sidewalks where the bike lane used to be. And there is no room, and it's a school transportation route, and I'm observing people riding their bikes on the sidewalk regularly because it's so unsafe to be anywhere else. So there is partially a bike lane, long-winded explanation, but the reason is that I think we're going to have to redo that road this year. And because it's going to be redone, I don't want to forget about the bike lanes and the sidewalk considerations that need to be taken into account. If we're going to do it, let's do it right and do it once.
So through the chair, the intention of the repaving program isn't to install bike lanes or sidewalks. It is to repave those damaged areas of roadways. And we're trying to step forward. This is the first year that we're actually proposing to do work. So although you saw it on your agenda last year and was accepted for budget, we've pulled back this year because we didn't get it commenced last year because of changes. And we're working to get it this year and establish that program and basis. So what we've done is we've met with CRD. We're working on areas that we have installed sewer and services, and we're tackling those first, our hardest hits areas, and then again creating those shelf-ready projects. So specifically about Chosen Road and some poor areas of Chosen Road, we're going to see a fairly significant chunk constructed by the Royal Bay developer in 2020-21 along that stretch of where we're heavily treed. And then the other areas, again, I'm trying to do the shelf-ready objectives so that way council can pick at their whim. Yes, we've got money. Let's please budget for that program. So piecework with the repaving program, minor repair and not necessarily pothole works, but whole chunks of roadway where the services are already installed. And we're certainly building forward to exactly the goals that you've spoken about, Councillor Day.
Okay. So I remain concerned that we lost basically the shoulder of the road for the sidewalk, and a solution needs to be found because it's unsafe.
If we could go back to the last slide, sorry. So all good. I thought I heard you say, Jen, that things like the bike lane and the sidewalk program would be funded by the sustainable infrastructure. Is that, did you say that?
I think I did say that. Bear with me. Any upgrades, maintenance work would be sustainable infrastructure. New would not be through the Sustainable Infrastructure Reserve. These two programs here are stemming out of the works we commented on earlier under our special project with long-range planning. So the intention is that in 2020, we start the plan for the sidewalks and bike lanes, and that will help drive potential locations for this work. And depending on if it's new work or if it's upgrades, improvements, that will impact how we are funding these works.
So new versus upgrade is sort of I don't know quite how you would draw that line, but you know, sustainable infrastructure, as I understood it, was putting money away to build things to the current standards when they fail. But we haven't built them yet, which is one of the concerns I have about putting money into the Sustainable Infrastructure Fund. If we haven't built them yet, that's new construction, and that should be done before we, in my opinion, before we fund the replacement of it. But I guess we can debate all that when we get to sustainable infrastructure and whatever. I guess the only other thing is on, and I'm on page 77, the capital program summary, which I think the mayor got to first, so I think it's legitimate for me to talk about it. Funding source, reserve, surplus, and deferred revenue, but it doesn't say DCCs, and yet I think that a lot of this money is considered projects which I would hope could be covered by DCCs. So just run out of room to type that in, or is that...
Proposed use of DCCs is included within that line item, and I will specifically comment on the projects where we propose the use of road DCCs.
Well, I'll be quiet and let you get there.
So within 2020, administration is going to help council work through a conversation to look at our sustainable infrastructure plan. And we are going to parse out those roadways, for example, that currently don't have curb and gutter, sidewalk, street lights. And the sustainable infrastructure plan should be set up for that section of roadway such that monies are set aside to replace exactly what's there. If we're looking to add a sidewalk to that roadway or add curb and gutter or add street lights, that would be new infrastructure, and we will need to identify a different set of funds to set up to put the sidewalk in the first time, or put the storm drain in the first time, or the street lights. So we will go through a process this year to sever those two things, and they will be funded from different sources.
Thank you, Worship. Through you to Jen and Brent, and perhaps Robert touched on it a little bit. Are we nimble enough to, when we have a project, to be able to partner with a developer to complete a specific section of sidewalk? And I'll use an example of the project on Souk Road that's just begun. That starts, I'll say 20 meters away from Linlark, as an example. Are we nimble enough to be able to fill in that 20 meters of curb, gutter, and sidewalk and other improvements at the same time that the developer is putting in their works to obtain an economy of scale, but a better project, better looking project, and a safer project?
Through the chair, we're definitely nimble enough to have that extra 20 meters, so to speak, done. The question that I have to ask is depending on the funding source. If there's excess in some other budget that's similar, a sidewalk fund, for example, that I can contribute for that, and as council so willing, I can definitely be nimble enough to do that. It's easy to add that sort of thing on, those little pieces. This budget doesn't represent those little segments, though.
So we've commented on a couple of our shelf-ready projects. So these have been identified as both the Machosen Road improvements from Ben Homer Road to Cotlow and the Painter Road improvements. So work was initiated in 2019 on design work only to get these shelf-ready projects in place. The 2020 budget nominal funding, that represents the remaining budget that's required to finalize the design works for both of those projects. We have put placeholder budgets in place for 2021. Should construction proceed on this design work, the 2021 budget will be revised once we receive that finalized design works.
Sorry, can I clarify? Maybe I misheard you. So it's $5K for the design work, not $500K for the design work, correct?
It's closer to $50,000 for the design work. The bulk of the design work occurred in 2019. We're working with the consultant to finalize the design work in early 2020. And then we will have those 2 shelf-ready projects there.
So what is that $5K?
That represents the final piece of funding required to finalize the design work. We've spent approximately $45,000 in 2019 on these projects.
So we're going to, sorry, I just want to be clear. We're going to spend $5,000 this year to finalize something that we're not going to build till 2021?
Through the chair, having to look at the capacity, the amount of development that's coming down the line, the amount of works that are associated with that development, and the sort of questions that I've received previously on how we're going to do it all, I've had to be very deliberate in terms of the budget intention, obviously sortable by council. So my intention is to, frankly, get our feet on the ground and give council some options in future years. As we've only got a nominal amount of design work left for those 2 projects, the initial intent was completed as part of that shelf-ready intent for council to choose now we wish to do that or now we don't wish to do that or please hold that. Those, if council wished, could certainly come forward as budget items, in which case we would be floating in this budget consideration for the Painter Road upgrades, for example, $2 million of expenditure potentially, and for the Machosen Road upgrades, $1.25 million of expenditures. As we're starting out now, without those budgets complete, I felt that going with the option for council's consideration of the shelf-ready intent may be the best way to conclude this year so we have success in meeting the objectives as set forward by the budget.
And if council elected that they wanted to go on those projects quicker sometime this year, they would be funded from surplus monies that we have already. They wouldn't affect the tax rate for this year, would they? Or could be funded from money we have.
It would not affect the tax rate this year, but we would do analysis and bring that information back at a following budget meeting on the funding sources that could be used. Lastly, under previously approved projects, last year it was referred to as the bus stop improvements. We're referring to those works as transit improvements. The 2020 spend is consistent with what council has resolved for 8 bus stop improvements, and that work is scheduled for 2020. So we'll now move along to a number of new road infrastructure projects. Road corridor improvements. We touched on these at the last meeting. This is a proposed new ongoing program where we would set aside annual funding in the amount of $30,000, and this would give us the authority to do a spend should anything arise during the year for nodule improvements throughout the city. Machosen Road improvements. So the 2020 budget is proposed for design work, again, to create a shelf-ready project. And this is the portion of Machosen Road that extends from Souk Road to Royal Bay. And the 2021 budget is a placeholder budget for construction, and that estimate would be revised upon receiving design work. Souk Road improvements, again, looking to do design work in 2020. Following receipt of that design work, we revise the construction estimate for 2021. The Latoria and VM intersection. Earlier last month, staff presented a traffic consideration report for South Colwood that was specific to the Royal Bay area. This project here represents the city's portion, so the 50% funding required to design and construct that one-lane roundabout at the Latoria and VMP intersection. Souk and Machosen intersection, the financial plan proposes spend between 2020 and 2023. So last year we engaged a consultant to undertake a safety review of this intersection. The 2020 budget represents funding for the implementation of some minor safety improvements. The 2022 budget is intended for design of the intersection upgrade, and the 2023 budget, again, is a placeholder budget for construction, and that estimate would be revised upon receiving the design works. The Allendale Works and Services. So again, the staff presented to council earlier last month. This is improvements to serve the Allendale lands, so Allendale Road, Wildcat Lane, as well as a portion of Veterans Memorial Parkway. The draft financial plan as it stands right now represents the city's approximate share of those works, about 73%. We will be updating the financial plan in the next version to show the full cost of the works, approximately $5 million, and that will be in part funded the developer's contribution of approximately 27%, and then the city's contribution. We do intend to use road DCC funding of approximately $1 million as authorized under our current road DCC bylaw. As well, we are looking at using gas tax funding for this project. And I will comment on that discussion in the past around gas tax funding has been that it could be used as one of our sources of funding for replacement of infrastructure, not for new infrastructure. So staff have drafted the budget with the intention that that funding would be repaid in subsequent years. So in other words, we would internally borrow that funding and repay to set that funding aside. And that has been proposed for 2021. And we would recommend that new construction taxation revenue be used to fund that repayment of the internal borrow on the Allendale Road works. And lastly, we're proposing expenditure for speed reader boards, but also for speed data collectors that would allow for the monitoring of vehicle speed, volumes, etc. And so that we can then have some information and statistics to look at if there's specific areas of the community that require, for example, traffic calming measures. And with that, that's a completion of the road infrastructure program.
So can you tell me, I'll go to committee in a second. Can you tell me, if I go back to the chart, then the capital program summary. In 2020, there's $5.2 million coming out of reserves to pay for things. some sort of infrastructure. I'm not exactly sure, because is it the Allendale, or is the Allendale the 2021 4.1 million that we're borrowing?
The proposed borrowing in 2021 is for the Esquimalt Lagoon Pump Station move. The Allendale is rolled up into both the gas tax line to the tune of approximately 2.2 million. And then we have approximately 1.1 million in road DCC funding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Jen, for your explanation on the speed reader data collection system and what we're going to do once we receive that data. That's very useful. I really think we're heading in the right direction in terms of having some shelf-ready projects going. I mean, we should have probably done that about 20 years ago. So I do really appreciate the initiative on that one for sure. My question, I guess, through you to Jen or Brent, once we get an idea on what the cost amount is for each project, will staff be applying for grant opportunities automatically, or is that something that may come back to council to prioritize, as an example, so we can take advantage of various grant programs that may not line up with budget?
Yes, we will certainly explore grant opportunities as they arise. Some of these projects we have already flagged that they have the potential grants, even ICBC grants pertaining to some of the traffic calming measures in the speed reader, but we will seek out where there are opportunities.
Excellent, because I trust our MLA and MP watch these meetings religiously, so they'll know that we'll be soliciting their support. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that I understood the Allendale road works as you described. We're going to internally borrow from the gas tax funds and then replace that from new taxation?
Yes, that's what's being proposed.
Okay. And has that been done before?
My recollection, the last time I believe we internally borrowed was on some sewer infrastructure works that was done a number of years ago.
Okay. Just, I know we've had discussions about what is appropriate for gas tax and what isn't in the past. And I've seen a few potential hiccups in other municipalities where they've used the gas tax, but never seemed to amount to anything, so it's just curious. And I also just wanted to inquire, when we're talking about the Allendale Roadworks and Services, what about, like Machosen Road may have a left turn lane at some point in time going into the Allendale area? Would that be included in that, or is that something that's strictly to do with Machosen Road?
Thank you for the question. Through the recently submitted traffic studies, we do know that such improvements will be necessary on Machosen Road. It is not included in the budget proposal that you're seeing. Allendale, with the works as proposed, isn't actually intended to connect for several years more. And it would be reliant on development to provide that connection. And at that time, that left turn would probably come forward as a budget item.
Okay. Just because the Machosen road improvements are going to be studied this year and then looked at the following year. And I think that as traffic gets busier, we're going to have to grapple with something that was grappled with probably 20 years ago, which is the backing up of the queue at Suk and Machosen roads. So access to Allendale might help us juggle our finances much better, because then there would be some other options.
Jensen.
Thanks, Jen. Allendale Roadworks, $3.3 million. It says 4.5 up here. Is there something missing, or am I missing something?
The comment I made moments ago, the initial draft just reflects the city's portion, which is approximately 73%.
Okay.
We're going to update the draft so that it shows the full 100% cost. We're going to recognize a developer contribution that will assist in the difference that you see between the 4.5 and what's in the version 1 before you.
And help me out with this gas tax, moving money around. Can we
Certainly.
not just spend gas tax money on building an intersection? You telling me that doesn't fit?
Yes, you can. So this project does qualify for the use of gas tax funds. For council to consider is that our gas tax funding has there's many ways in which we could spend this funding. So later in this year, as we revisit our sustainable infrastructure plan and some of the tactics that we have in place for what funding will be available for future spend, that is where we can make the decisions about whether or not we simply outright spend gas tax dollars on new infrastructure, or we preserve that funding for some use of sustainable infrastructure. The reason that staff have proposed setting aside additional funding, so whether we call it a repayment of the use of that funding or just recognition that we have used, to the tune of $2.2 million in funding that's available, do we wish to set aside future years' taxation so that we still preserve some of the funds that we have recently spoken about having on hand for purposes of sustainable infrastructure? And that's a conversation that we will be having in greater detail this year as we revisit that plan. So
Okay,
that,
I think I got it. Is you're saying there's more flexibility in one fund to do things with versus the other fund. So if we shuffle money back and forth, we keep our options open, kind of deal.
in part, it's recognition that this is a large spend of grant monies that we may have also commented on in recent time that could be set aside for other purposes.
Thank you. I'm going to look to our CAO. There's been several examples throughout this evening where we are doing a reevaluation of plans that were done in 2012, 2015, and we're updating them because we never moved those projects along. Do you feel confident that I'm looking at these design, there's several of them there, that we're actually going to be able to move these projects forward in the next few years, or am I going to end up in 4 years again spending another $50,000 to do an update on the design that we occurred, that we did in 2020?
So I'll answer a couple of different ways. 10-year capital plans or 5-year capital plans, it is not uncommon to get only 30% of the work done or 40% of the work done. So it's not uncommon for projects to move from year to year as either capacity of the organization and or other priorities have come along. And so I've always taken the position it would be more helpful if we created a 5-year capital plan that didn't kind of cut off at the end of the calendar year and start the next, because it creates a false expectation that the project can occur. That said, administration is going to endeavor this year to fully leverage any pre-planning that's been done, any pre-master work that's been done, any pre-design that's been done, and just update that where needed and move to get to a position where we can execute on projects. In the fullness of time, I think that it would benefit the organization to move from a situation of design 1 year, construct the next, to scope 1 year, pre-design, and then construct. And if we had a 3-year cycle where we actually looked more deeply at the scope of the project, that would help both council and administration be better at ultimately cost estimating the project and then estimating the design. And so, you know, I'd like to suggest we're going to get all this done and we're going to hit, you know, dot all the I's and cross all the T's. We're not. We're going to get a portion of it done, and we're going to get more precise over time in our capacity to understand both cost estimating in terms of the projects and our capacities to get them across the line.
So I'll reflect your feelings, and I guess that's one of my concerns is if we're spending a bunch of money doing designs and we're only going to get 30% of those actual projects in building and breaking it down, because that's been my experience to this point, being on council over the last 9 years, that we have done a lot of design of things and then we've never actually been able to actually begin to build the capital or infrastructure around that. So I guess my question is, do you feel significantly comfortable with all the design ask spends that we're doing if we're not going to be able to actually build these things out in the next short period of time? I guess where I'm coming from is these asks that are before us this evening, they would suggest to me that we have a fairly high confidence that we'll be able to move those projects along, correct?
You know, administration will not move forward with a design on a project that we don't think in the near term is going to get complete, either in terms of our capacity to get it across the line or in terms of our understanding of council's desire to do the work. That said, the financial capacity of the organization to move projects forward will be a limiting factor, and council will help administration determine where focus needs to be brought. If we get a design, as has been discussed, kind of on the shelf and ready to go, it helps us move more quickly if and when a grant comes or if and when the finances come to pass. But I can assure you that administration will not move forward spending money on the design of a project that we don't believe we're going to execute on.
So with that, we'll move along to building infrastructure, summarized on page 82 of the draft plan. I commented earlier this evening on the city's share of the West Shore Detachment Building upgrades that occurred in 2019. We have received estimates from the RCMP detachment on their proposed spend between 2020 and 2023, and that has been reflected in the financial plan. St. John's Church improvements, again, this is a placeholder budget that authorizes expenditure of their reserve should any capital works be required. Moving along to new capital that's identified under the financial plan. Following the City Hall space planning works, we have put aside a placeholder budget should there be a need for construction works at City Hall or for furniture for purposes of meeting space, desk spaces, offices. There is funding set aside for HVAC maintenance here at the City Hall. As well, we've identified immediate repairs that are needed for a portion of the City Hall roof soffit. And there has been a placeholder budget proposed for 2021 following a facilities review should it be determined and should council decide that we want to do a full replacement of the soffit here at City Hall. And lastly, we've identified spend of approximately $50,000 for training facility located at the fire hall. As well as for next year, implementing area lighting for the fire hall training. I'll take pause on any questions pertaining to building infrastructure.
it's been forever that the pillars in the front are just, and because clearly we removed something over top, and it looks, in my opinion, unfinished, and it just doesn't look like a city hall should look. Have we ever looked at what we were doing with those pillars? Can we remove them? Can we utilize them so that it actually looks aesthetically pleasing? You know, we just have these concrete pillars in the middle of a hall or down a aisle. So where has that been, and where are we at from that standpoint?
The concrete pillars are structural members for the building. So they could be removed as part of a larger structural refit of the building. But we would have to look at it in terms of course, cost and displacement of staff during the work. We can explore that if council wishes.
Sorry, are we talking about the same pillars? We're talking about the pillars that are outside.
I'm sorry, I thought you were referring to
No,
the
no,
ones
no, that's
outside.
okay. No, I was thinking, why are we displacing staff on the outside? So go for it again.
We could look at doing something to improve the aesthetics of it, if you wish.
I'm sorry.
We could do something to look at improving the aesthetics of it, if you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the pillars that are outside were holding up a pergola glass roof, which was quite heavy, and they have moved over time, as have a lot of things at the site here, because this was previously a gravel pit, and I guess it just didn't stay put. So it would be, I think, maybe a little premature. I think we need to know our facilities condition assessment before we make a plan to beautify City Hall. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Mr. Mayor, but I think we need the big picture before we make a plan.
So what I hear you saying, Councillor Day, is to accelerate the depreciation report of at least this building to make sure that we're not throwing good money after bad. It's not a bad idea, actually. I think I could support that. They tend not to take very long. Just get a whole look at the whole building and make sure that it's going to be around long enough to justify spending $1 million on the soffits. And also to give us what it's going to cost to keep it around for that long. And make sure we set the budget. It's probably about time if there isn't such a report available.
Moving along to drainage infrastructure. So the city does have an annual capital general drainage budget. The intention in 2020 is to do preliminary works and assessment, and then look in 2021 to do some of the capital expenditure pertaining to drainage. And again, this is on page 84 of the draft financial plan.
Okay. Yes, we have a bunch of drainage, and yes, we should look after it and do what needs to be done. I noticed last year the estimate was to start with 22,000 last year and spend $1 million this year, stretching out for quite some time. And now we've slowed it down to spend 50,000 this year and $500,000 next year and the one after. And again, I'm all for, if we have drainage facilities, we should look after and make sure they're working great. Are these just, call them placeholders, these numbers? Okay, let's placehold, I guess. I don't know.
Infrastructure remaining. So we're on page 85 of the draft financial plan. Annually, the city set aside funding for equipment for purposes of the fire department for the self-contained breathing apparatus. We also set aside annual funding for both IT, our desktop replacement program, and network hardware program. And that funding is tied in with the expectation of every few years when we will need to do a large refresh. Moving along to software, records management, this was work that was initiated in 2019, and the city will work to complete the implementation of that software in 2020. Land development, we initiated this work in 2019, went out to RFP, and we have not yet moved forward on selecting a proponent, in part turnover in key staff that were involved, as well as competing priorities. So this work with the land development software will continue in late 2020, and we expect to see implementation in 2021. We do set aside some funding for upgrades for software as necessary. What we've identified in 2020 is the need for a work order solution, and so we'll be working on that. Moving into 2021, we are looking at tools for asset management. Lastly, the equipment noted for council chambers. So this is funding that was set aside in 2019. We upgraded the video and microphone equipment. We've retained this budget here should funding be required for furniture for the configuration works that have been discussed in recent months. Maybe take pause if there's any questions on that equipment.
Of course, I had to be the fly in the works. Just in terms of for upgrades for the council equipment, when people are watching from at home and we have slides that are up there, it'd be nice if we could be able to get the camera to show the slides. So maybe there could be a button that it would focus on the screen, so that the people who are watching from home could see what we're looking at. Just thought I'd throw that in there while I could.
Thank you. So the city has set aside funding. Excuse me. So we're looking at funding exhaust extraction rails at Colwood Fire Hall, new vehicle exhaust update. With respect to IT equipment, we're looking at both the replacement of an aging backup server, as well as replacement of our phone system that is no longer licensed and requires upgrade. Lastly, 3 items pertaining to public works. We're looking at a pickup dump truck insert. We're looking at a hot box reclaimer. This is a piece of equipment that's used to preserve asphalt. And lastly, a ride-on mower and trailer. So this would reduce our mowing times and just increase efficiency with respect to, in particular, parks maintenance and some of the boulevard maintenance there. Just continuing on, we're looking at replacement of 2 electric vehicle charging stations that are located at West Shore Parks and Recreation Society. So the society funds the maintenance of these stations, but the city purchased these electric vehicles charging stations some years ago, and they are no longer in working order. We're also looking at replacement of an aging generator located over at Public Works. We're looking at a crack sealing machine, another spend to increase efficiency when it comes to crack sealing works, as well as a brine maker that would be used for snow and ice purposes. And lastly, proposed spend in 2021 for Murphy beds at the fire hall to support increased staff, volunteer availability, and response times by providing overnight accommodation at Colwood Fire Hall. And so with that, that's an overview of the proposed equipment spend. Happy to answer any questions.
So we don't have a charging station that works here at the city hall because I have an electric car, and number 2 doesn't work. Well, number 1 works, but number 2 doesn't work. So I'm not sure why we're not replacing that before we're replacing this. Number 2 hasn't worked for at least 6 months. The replacement of the charging station at West Shore Park and Rec, I don't really believe that that's our responsibility. I understand that we initially put them in, and we put them in through Solar Colwood because we had a grant, but those are on West Shore Park and Rec property lands, and that should be West Shore Parks and Rec's responsibility, not the city's responsibility to replace those, in my opinion.
Moving along to fleet, so the purchase of the new Pumper 51 Fire truck is in progress, well underway, and this is expected later this quarter that we'll have this delivered. We also have annual funding set aside for the next few years. This is for purposes of outfitting our fire trucks with electronic mapping tool. We have one proposed new spend for fleet, and that is for a multi-purpose bucket truck for purposes of public works to allow for efficiency and safety with elevated maintenance and installation works. And lastly, Fire Rescue 56 is slated to be replaced in 2024. Happy to answer any questions pertaining to the fleet.
Just on the bucket truck, wondering how much elevated maintenance is done besides putting up Christmas lights.
Through the chair, the intention would be, right now we have to resource out services for even changing a light bulb on a street light. We would have to resource out almost the need to change a banner arm, with the intention of many of our new streetlights being installed with the banner intent. I think that is proposed as an option to improve our efficiency, so we can deal with those in-house at a faster, more readily basis. So it would be any elevated ground. So we're looking at banners and baskets, potentially streetlights. We're looking at Christmas lights. We're looking at tree trimming. There's actually a multitude of facets that we'll do with the bucket truck.
So how much do you spend on renting one now?
We had an initial analysis of what we're spending on rentals, and it varies, but we're looking at a few thousand a year or so. I should comment, staff are currently reviewing this proposed budget is on the high end. We're looking at what bucket trucks are available used, and just in the last couple of days we were getting quotes in that were much lower, at between $50,000 and $75,000. So staff are doing that analysis, and we'll have updates on that information at a subsequent budget meeting. So moving along to parks infrastructure, this starts on page 90. So there's a number of items that were approved under the 2019 to 23 plan that are either underway or have been deferred. So the city has been updating park signage throughout the city, and we will be continuing that work. Lookout Brook Dam safety upgrades. This figure will be revised up to $1.6 million, so just approximately $20,000 change that will be coming in the next version on the March 10th meeting. This budget reflects the Class D cost estimate for the buttressing option that was discussed, I believe it was late last fall. This project will be funded by way of grant funding. So it was just announced this morning that the city was successful in receiving a $750,000 grant on this works, and as well intends to fund the remainder by way of gas tax funding. Murray's Pond Boardwalk, this is a proposed expenditure. Design works will start in 2020 and looking to have construction in 2021. The Cobourg Peninsula Beach Nourishment. This is a project that staff are expecting will be discussed with the Coastal Waterfront Committee. And the Latoria Creek Park stair replacement. This was approved, identified under the 2019 financial plan. Moving into 2020, the city will be in a place to select which refurbishment option we would like to see, and depending on the materials selected, that $321,000 is the maximum spend on this budget. Under new requests, recent conversation about the potential relocation of the cenotaph that's located over at the West Shore Parks and Rec Society. There may be some funding available to assist with funding this move, but should we wish to look at this move, this is the expected cost of that move. And lastly, there's recent discussions about if the city wishes to purchase and basically installed a small greenhouse over at the community garden here at City Hall. And so that's the funding there that we expect would be required should we wish to proceed with the greenhouse. And that's an initial overview of parks, and I'll turn it over to the director, Brent, here.
Thank you very much, and through the chair. The cenotaph relocation should be noted, it hasn't been spoken to or commented on to West Shore Parks and Recreation at any facet. This came from the works that happened in November with council members and the suggested budget improvements, so that is why that is there. In terms of the community garden, that as well came from initiative from several members of council in trying to relocate the Pacific Landing greenhouse, which was proved to be unusable as a relocated asset. And so we thought it worth discussion if council wished to facilitate that for the Community Garden Society.
So, sorry, can you explain this to me? So what's the difference between this just showing up on a budget line item versus the Garden Society coming and asking for a grant to build a greenhouse? I'm not sure why the city, is this a city greenhouse that is going to be in the community garden?
This is proposed as a result of conversations that occurred in a council meeting late last year.
Thank you. So just in regards to the cenotaph relocation, that is something that needs to have considerable discussion with the community. I certainly will admit to having a bias. It's been there for a very long time. I don't think that it's a slam dunk that you can just pick up, you know, a cenotaph and move it. However, in fairness, I should point out that there were discussions about relocating it to Colwood Corners quite a long time ago. A previous proponent of the development had considered that they would welcome it in a square that they might create. But that didn't get as far as having public input on how the public felt about it. And certainly the scouting community has been gathering at that cenotaph for as long as I've lived in Colwood. And so it's not something that I think we should just put up a plan and say, let's get on with it. There needs to be considerable consultation that takes place. It might be better to call it improvement rather than relocation. I don't know. And just on the community garden greenhouse idea, I am supportive of doing something, but I think it needs a bit more development as a plan. Much like the mayor, I didn't know if this was something that Public Works would utilize to grow plants to put in boulevards or what it would be. But I think that the community garden is a great success, and having a greenhouse option to start plants might be very beneficial. But again, I think it's very early days to just put this in the budget without it going to some committee or having some sort of discussion, engagement, something about it. So I feel a little uncomfortable, although I am supportive of moving forward with something in some way, but I'm not completely comfortable with it just showing up in the budget and I don't know what we're talking about.
So with these proposals, there's the option to remove it, shift it from years, because I would say that both of these items, the cenotaph discussion and the greenhouse, haven't had the proper consultation with either respective party in terms of the use and management of the system. It has been tabled that Public Works may be able to use the greenhouse as a growing platform. However, that's a whole different scope and scale to our work environment. That also hasn't been discussed. So these are very early. I agree completely with your comments. They're very early, and that's why they're there for your consideration and placement if necessary.
There we go. Yeah, so I guess my feeling on it, and seeing that Councillor Parkinson has something to say as well, I won't jump forward with any motions at this point in time, but it might be better located in a future year and give us a chance to do some of that groundwork to determine if there's support, you know, who wants what.
Yeah, okay, a few comments. The community greenhouse, I don't myself see it working as a combined city works and community garden greenhouse. You know, if they need greenhouses, they should each have their own. I don't think when the community garden came here and made an excellent presentation, I didn't hear a pitch for $40,000 for greenhouse. So I would suggest we could perhaps leave that one until there's a demonstrated public desire for it, and even if there was, I'm not sure the city's place would be to buy a greenhouse for the community garden people. So, but that's a discussion to be had if and when it comes up. The cenotaph relocation, I would definitely leave that in there and rebuild as is required. Gets a couple of carpenters. It wouldn't be a lot of fun, but it would be a lot cheaper, and then perhaps just be a little more vigilant with the maintenance of it. So, you know, I don't think we're going to end up spending $320,000 of our own money on it. The beach nourishment, nice number to have in there. The waterfront committee will wrestle with that and other issues. Whether that's one of the things that comes forward to council for recommendation. I don't think it'll make it this year, so no sense putting that money in this year's budget. I think it was in a previous budget, so as it doesn't matter. And the dam safety upgrades, the 1.5 or 1.6 million Class D estimate. When are we expecting a Class B estimate or something more comfortable? You know, I think everybody knows I was a little uncomfortable with this project and whether it was fully understood and scoped out. So I just would hope we're going to get some feedback on this at some point.
So the chair, we should have that estimate confirmed within about 2 months. We're right now working on the drawdown plan for the water level in the dam, meeting the fish window and the objectives for the environmental conditions there. And once we draw that level down, we'll be able to have a better assessment of the back slope and bring that estimate forward.
Just to comment on the Latoria Creek stairway replacement, we have followed up with the grant application. We don't yet have word.
And through the chair, we are planning to come back, as Councillor Parkinson notes, to select the option as selected by council. That is the highest number that you can see there.
Lastly, sewer utility infrastructure, page 92. The Ocean Boulevard pump station, ultimately this is a project that it's further discussion is required. So last year, the city did apply for grant funding and we were not successful with our application. The proposed expenditure that you see before you, 2020, would be to finalize design work that is underway. And 2021 is, should the city, and again, through the Waterfront Coastal Processes Committee, there may be a recommendation on how we move forward on this project. But that 2021 estimate would be refined upon completion of the design work, and that right now is the estimate for moving the pump station to the proposed location of Pitt House Park.
Sorry, through the chair, you see some conversation going on here. What happened in 2019, at the end of 2019, is we were advised that that estimate of 4.1 is off by about 30%. So the design elements that are intending to come forward in 2020 are just to give us a better concept of design. What's been revealed, though, in the last part of 2019, 2020 is the amount of conversions that would be necessary for many of the sewered properties on private properties is growing. The comment that I made to the finance beside me is that it wasn't our intention to continue with that design in 2020 until if council was so willing, until the committee had finished their conclusions. We'd finished mapping out the inundation zone and tsunami zone, and then would come forward with a realistic budget number and better placement options for that system.
Yeah, I would concur with perhaps holding off a little bit on this, and we'll see what the Waterfront Committee looks at. But you said the 4.1 million you thought was 30% low. So last year it was 2.7 million, and this year it's 4.1, and next year it's 5 point something or other.
Thank you. There's two recommendations that I'd like to make to improve our budgeting for this year. And one is to remove the community garden greenhouse from the list of new capital requests and change the name of the cenotaph to cenotaph improvement instead of relocation. And the other last thing that I have is just going back to the St. John's Church and the Heritage Commission, which is getting going this year. I'd like to request that we put the $10,000 of the $13,000 that we saved by not having a Heritage Commission this year as a reserve for the committee for projects, which they may determine. There's a number of people who've been appointed to the Heritage Commission who have specifically excellent knowledge, and there may be projects that the Heritage Commission can do to deal with some of our historical documents, of which there are many. You know, whether it's archiving or archival indexes, or I don't know what their projects may be, but just they're getting started. They have great skills on the committee, knowledge, and therefore there may be a project that they would like to ask council's permission to do, and I would like us to have money available to them if they're prepared.
So Councillor Day, that was a little long, so could you maybe make the motion?
So my motion is that we remove the community garden greenhouse, change the name to Cenotaph Improvements, and add $10,000 for the Heritage Commission projects this year.
Thank you. So I have a mover, which is Councillor Day. I guess I don't need seconders in COTW. Can a clarifying statement? The going to Heritage, I don't mind putting it in the budget, but they will still need to come back to council to spend, correct? That's your intention? Okay, thank you. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question on that. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. So that's on that specific motion. So are we done? Because I do have a couple of questions, but it's not specifically around sewer utility. It's around capital infrastructure, just in general. So when you're ready, but I don't want to keep going. I'd rather you finish and then I'll ask.
So with that, that's a complete review of the draft financial plan.
Okay, thank you. I had a correspondence today even, so I've had probably in the dozens of correspondence in the last year or so regarding a boardwalk, specifically a boardwalk going from Lagoon, where the pump station presently is, into the Royal Bay lands. When do we anticipate that we would be building some sort of pathway, and is that in a budget somewhere?
Well, on a preliminary basis, I don't have a date for you on that one. We're working with that concept with the Royal Bay lands firstly, and then the Trail Master Plan is coming out of it, and there'll be a parks review, I believe, scheduled for 2020.
So in addition to that, there's been comments around people requesting some sort of pathway along Ocean Boulevard, either on the water side or on the lagoon side, to keep people safe as they travel. There's a sort of an informal path right now on the lagoon side, but do we plan on having a budget, and where is that within the budget, and when do we anticipate that we would actually start designing that and building that?
Sorry, page 51 of the document, third item down, and it will be our waterfront committee that helps us with this. And so that's to create a plan that would provide direction on the implementation of future public amenities, which would include the two that you just referenced. And so the thinking is 2021. Now, depending on the speed of the waterfront committee, they could achieve this work in 2020, but projects themselves then would be scoped in 2021 or 2022, designed and then budgeted.
Is that in the 5-year plan?
Not currently. We're kind of waiting for the waterfront plan, and the waterfront plan would then contain components, and then those would be scoped from there. So at this juncture, we administration wouldn't know what to scope, but we're hoping the new waterfront committee will create this public realm plan for the waterfront.
Thank you. So interestingly enough, no good idea ever actually goes away. So the boardwalk idea was floated 10 years ago when I was chair of Parks and Recreation. And there's a couple of fairly significant issues to be considered. One is accessibility, because there are a lot of people with disabilities who really enjoy using the lagoon, and it would be great if they could have safe passage along there as well. And the other is the environment. So it can be very challenging, and I worked quite a lot with the Esquimalt Lagoon Stewardship Initiative, because we don't want a new project that we develop down there to undo a lot of the great volunteer work that has already taken place. So I just know that that's not an easy project to get off the ground, but I think that our public is getting a lot more informed and they're a lot more on board. So hopefully that can come to fruition, because I think it would be a really great addition.
I guess I would look to this to committee if there are any infrastructure things that were not within the budget, but you have a desire to see within the next 5 years. This would probably be an opportunity to at least get it out so that staff have an understanding that that's what you wish. So if there are any infrastructure things, I would suggest. Otherwise, we're done tonight.
Correct. Otherwise, we're done for the night, and we'll reconvene on March 10th. You'll have the revised budget updated before you with those recommendations and an opportunity for a discussion on tax rate ratios.
Okay, I will, oh, no, sorry, Councillor Parkinson first.
Well, if you're going to give me a soapbox, I'm going to stand on it. If you're looking at infrastructure that I think we should be working towards over the next 5 years, it's basically sidewalks and Triangle Mountain sewers. And I'd like to, I think sidewalks we've talked about a little bit, sewers we've talked about a little bit, but I think those are two important things for, again, as I see, trying to turn Colwood of today into the city of tomorrow.
Thank you. Just following on that same theme, I concur. I think we have a lot of plans coming up that are going to really inform a lot of the things that we need. But one of the things that I haven't seen on our radar that I think really does need to be there, and maybe it quietly is there, just hasn't, you know, come with fireworks or whatever, but it's the Mechosen Road intersection, Mechosen and Souk Road. That area, when the development occurred, like 20 years ago, was planned to be a 4-lane road there. And it certainly isn't that. And, you know, that's changed over the years, but there still is a need to be able to accommodate more cars at that intersection. That's high on my priority list, because if we don't get that right, then it's going to back up a whole lot of things.
Through the chair, I'll draw attention to it without page referencing, but there is money put aside or requested for consideration in 2020 for minor upgrades, and then a more significant spend in 2022. The reason why that's pushed off for the more significant spend in 2022 is because presently we're working with BC Transit in terms of part of their queue jump potentials. There was a need to do immediate safety improvements because of our incidences in the latter part of 2019. The improvements that we undertake this year will be for that, and we're already working with ICBC on some funding models. But the reason why I need another year to negotiate with BC Transit for the queue jump lanes and the potential for geometrics along that place before we bring back an item in 2022 for a potential upgrade for full geometric review.
And just to reinforce that, I was at BC Transit today, and it was actually discussed, the West Shore lines, and so yeah, they're on board as well for 2021. Councillor Logan has moved adjournment. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried.